We tend to talk about the Great Depression as if everyone knew all at once that the world had changed. But history rarely unfolded that neatly. Most people are standing inside the moment before they understand what it means. They are reading the headlines, listening to rumors, watching prices fall, wondering if this is temporary, balancing worry with optimism, and then little by little, the fear moves closer. From banks and stock exchanges, to businesses, to hotels, to dinner tables, to the quiet calculations families make when they begin to ask what they can afford to lose. Today on Author Notes, we're stepping into Canada in 1929, not the Great Depression as it would later be remembered, but the uneasy beginning, the moment before the decade had a name. Hi friends, welcome back to Author Notes. I'm Tanya E Williams. In today's historical deep dive, we're looking at the early days of the Great Depression in Canada, especially through the lens of Toronto and Vancouver, two cities connected to the final novel in the Hotel Hamilton series. And what interests me most about this moment is not only the financial collapse itself, but the uncertainty. Because before the Great Depression became a defining chapter of the 1930s, it was a series of frightening days, confusing headlines, and ordinary people trying to understand whether the world beneath their feet was beginning to shift. When we look back at October 1929, we have the advantage of hindsight. We know the stock market crash was not a passing disturbance. We are aware of how the economic collapse reached deep into families, farms, factories, businesses, and cities. We know the 1930s tested people in ways they could not yet imagine at the time. But the people living through those first days didn't know that. They had newspaper reports and they had rumors. They had brokers shouting into telephones, and some even knew friends who were suddenly ruined. Families' dinner-time conversations revolved singularly around savings, wages, and what might happen if work disappeared. And that is the part of history that often draws me in as a novelist. Not only the event itself, but the moment when people are still trying to name what is happening to them. One of the most vivid examples happened in Toronto on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. According to the Toronto Star, the panic in Toronto was not contained to newspaper columns or quiet conversations behind closed doors. It became physical. An enraged and panicked crowd of investors and sellers pushed their way onto the trading floor of the Toronto Stock Exchange. The crowd was so large that the building's doors could not be closed. Imagine that for a moment. Not a neat line graph in the local paper, not a calm financial report, but people pressing into the very rooms where fortunes were disappearing. Imagine the chaos as brokers shouted down phone lines and ticket kiosks were overwhelmed as investors tried to sell. Others desperate to understand what had already been lost. Across the city, thousands of margin calls were triggered as people who had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly faced losses they could not cover. That detail matters because it reminds us the crash was not abstract. It was emotional. It was public, and it was immediate. One day, a person might believe they had security. The next day, that security could vanish. And for many, the collapse was not only financial, it was personal. It affected marriages, households, reputations, plans, and even the future people thought they were building. But even then, not everyone would have understood the full scale of what was beginning. That's one of the strange things about major historical turning points. They don't always announce themselves clearly. Sometimes they arrive first as a ripple of unease, then as denial, then as adjustment, and only later do people realize that they've been living through the beginning of something much larger. In Canada, the crash came after a decade that had promised growth and modern possibility. Cities were expanding, consumer goods were changing daily life, and credit made certain comforts feel more accessible. Hotels, shops, offices, banks, railways, and businesses all belonged to a world that seemed to be moving forward. But that progress was not equally secure for everyone. Many families were already balancing carefully. A missed paycheck mattered. A failed business was impactful even before the crash. The decline of rail travel could equal layoffs. And a hotel with fewer guests meant something had to change. And when the wider economy began to falter in October of 1929, the effects did not stay on Bay Street or Wall Street. They traveled. They moved through workplaces and households for sure, but they showed up first in quieter ways. A postponed purchase, a nervous employer, a daughter's wages becoming more important than they had been before, a son suddenly unable to find work, a father too proud to admit the business was struggling, and a mother stretching meals further than anyone realized. Those are the human edges of economic history, and they are often where historical fiction finds its way in. Because we can study the dates and the statistics, but fiction asks a slightly different question. What did it feel like to live inside that uncertainty? What did it feel like before people knew how the story would end? For Toronto, the crash had a visible intensity because of its connection to finance and investment. But Vancouver had its own place in the story of the Depression. As a port city and a railway city, Vancouver was connected to movement, trade, migration, and the search for work. As the Depression deepened, unemployment and relief would become part of the city's story in very visible ways. But at the very beginning, there would have been the same unsettling question. Is this temporary, or is something larger happening? That question is important to me because the final Hotel Hamilton novel takes place just as the Great Depression begins. And for a hotel, that moment is rich with tension because a hotel is a place of movement. Guests arrive and leave. News travels. People bring their secrets and their dreams with them. They bring money, or sometimes the appearance of money. They bring ambition, disappointment, and the version of themselves they want the world to see. But in a moment of economic uncertainty, appearances become fragile. A guest who seemed wealthy one week might be desperate the next. Social standing might depend on how well a family can keep financial ruin a secret. An employee might hear more than they should. And a young woman building a new life might suddenly discover that the world she expected to enter is not as stable as it once appeared. That is one of the reasons this period fascinates me. The beginning of the Depression was not only about loss, it was about revelation. Financial pressure has a way of exposing what was already strained. It reveals who has options and who does not. The difference between status and security blur. And for women, those pressures can be especially complicated. Women's wages often matter deeply to their families, but women's paid work could also become controversial when many men were unemployed. A daughter working in an office, a shop, a hotel, or even as domestic help might be essential to keeping a household afloat, and yet that social expectation of respectability did not disappear simply because money was scarce. Women were often expected to adapt quietly, to help where needed, to sacrifice and to make do. That quiet pressure is exactly the kind of emotional history that stays with me. Because when we talk about the Great Depression, we often talk about breadlines, unemployment, stock prices, and relief. And those things are enormously important. But there's another layer too, the private layer. The moment when someone opens a letter and realizes the money is gone. Or when a family has to decide what can be sold. or perhaps when a woman understands the life plan for her may no longer be possible. Choosing between pride and survival become all too familiar of a state during the Depression, and those are the moments that make history intimate. When I think about Canada in 1929, I keep coming back to the people who did not yet know they were standing at the beginning of the Great Depression. They were simply trying to get through the day, trying to understand the headlines, and attempting to protect what they could, trying to anticipate what would come next. And that is where the title of this episode comes from, The Depression Before It Had a Name. Because before history becomes history, it's lived as uncertainty. And for a historical fiction author, that uncertainty is often where the story begins. So when we look back at October 1929, it's easy to see the beginning of the Great Depression. But for the people living through it, the future was still hidden. They were standing in the first tremors of a historical turning point, trying to understand what was happening as it happened. And that, to me, is where history becomes especially powerful. Not in the certainty of hindsight, but in the uncertainty of the moment itself. Thanks for joining me for this Author Notes historical deep dive. And my question for you today is this. When you read historical fiction set during a major event, are you more drawn to the event itself or to the ordinary people trying to survive it? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, happy reading!